Welcome to another episode of Blogging Head's Rational Actors. I'm Kevin Glass, managing editor at Town Hall, and today I'm here with
Jim Tankersley, economic policy correspondent at the Washington Post.
Great. Well, thanks for coming on with me, Jim.
It's my pleasure, buddy.
So what I wanted to do today is kind of hit on some of the economic news that's been coming out recently, and specifically first, I wanted to talk about President Obama's housing plan / outline that he discussed in a series of meetings last week. And I know a lot of economic policy writers and correspondents have been pushing for movement on housing and housing plans, basically since the 2008 financial crisis. And his kind of vague outline would be a form of winding down Fannie and Freddie, trying to define the federal government's role as a kind of a backstop of last resort for the housing market and for both lenders and borrowers. Now, to me, what's really interesting about what President Obama went over last week is there's actually a lot of overlap with what Republicans have been saying we should do for years. And Kevin Brady, who is the chair of the Joint Economic Committee, who is not a big fan of the president, actually put out last week after President Obama's housing plan kind of a breakdown of President Obama's talking points and what Republicans want to do. And to Kevin Brady's credit, I guess, he actually agreed with a lot of the broad goals President Obama outlined, while also trying to express skepticism that President Obama will actually stick to these goals or do them in the way that Republicans want to do. But I kind of wanted to get your take on some of this movement on housing policy that, maybe is occurring right now.
Yeah, Kevin, you're right. I feel like I started writing about housing policy when I first started at National Journal magazine as an economic correspondent in 2010, and then I wrote so much about it in the years after that because there was just nothing going on. And then finally we've had some movement, I think, in the last year. And now, the president has a plan that, you're right, has some Republican support and maybe some Republican blessing. It resembles a lot a bipartisan plan in the Senate, which a Democrat, Mark Warner from Virginia, and a Republican, Bob Corker from Tennessee, have put forth. And it breaks down to not a full extraction of the government from the housing market, but a shift. Just because the parties agree on something doesn't make it good. I mean, they agreed on a lot of the housing policies that got us in, that helped to get us into the conditions that got us into the financial crisis. But in this case, there's some things that they agree on, and I think the big one is this idea having to do with Fannie and Freddie. Some Republicans and the president agree that what they should do is transition it, wind down Fannie and Freddie, which right now are basically the only game in town to get a mortgage. They want to wind that down and replace it with something that's sort of modeled after the FDIC, and to make the government a big backstop, an insurer of last resort, to keep the 30-year mortgage, which is really sort of the big sacred cow in all this, to keep the 30-year mortgage alive, 30-year fixed-rate mortgage, and have a government sort of backstop for that so that banks will write those mortgages, as opposed to just pulling the government entirely out of the market or leaving it like it is, where the government really has a historically outsized role. So that's the thing where he is finding common ground on this plan. There are Republicans who would really like to go farther and to get rid of any government guarantees whatsoever. And that's something that a lot of Democrats oppose, but maybe more importantly in the way Washington works, that's something that a lot of really powerful interest groups in the housing industry oppose. And it's something that most Americans, might freak them out a little bit to think about the idea that there might not be 30-year fixed-rate mortgages anymore, because that's how we're so used to housing working. But that would be a possible, maybe even likely consequence of that shift of getting government backstops entirely out of the market. So there's a lot of actual policy detail here that matters. This is not just an ideological dispute, but it is. There are roots here of compromise, like you mentioned, and it's possible that what we call GSE reform, Fannie and Freddie reform, which looks like the hardest part of housing policy, could actually get done by the time this presidential term is over.
Right. Now that is kind of, I know a lot of progressives were kind of looked at that skeptically, actually, because that's kind of been a bedrock of progressive housing policies, is using GSEs and other federal programs to try and guarantee access to home ownership for low-income borrowers. And I know that was a huge concern with the Dodd-Frank Act, in that the Dodd-Frank Act put in a provision that the big banks had to retain what they called skin in the game when packaging mortgages to sell as trading products. Something like they had to cover the first 5% of losses if their trading products decreased in value. And then after that, there have basically been carve-outs as exceptions to that rule, saying that certain FHA loans shouldn't qualify, certain Fannie and Freddie loans shouldn't qualify, and then getting around to, well, even standard mortgage is if you have 10 or 15% down, which might not be as much as you should have, but even loans of that size should be exempted from the 5% loss requirement. And this doesn't really address the kind of low-income access that concerns that I think a lot of progressives have. But I think that the overall goal is trying to get the housing market in general to kind of stand on its own 2 feet, and at least have the threat of less government backstop in there. If I'm reading some of this right.
Yeah, I think that there's a couple of things going on here, and they're sometimes competing and sometimes not. One of the things is that there is a question, just a baseline question of who should have access to home lending. And what we've seen since the end of the crisis, since the recovery began, is that the government's been the one doing most of the loan origination for mortgages, and that the lending standards have gone way up. That it's harder to get a loan now if you're a lower income borrower or you have worse credit. And that may be one of the lessons of the crisis that sticks, is just that's just how it's going to be. But they're affordable housing advocates and advocates for people in minority communities who traditionally have struggled to get higher credit scores just because of the way the system works. They are pushing to try to change that a little bit. And on top of that, just that general question of who should get a loan and who shouldn't, and what should those loans look like, comes the question of how big should government be, and should we really have a quasi-government agency writing all these loans, and on top of that really rests the question of how much did the government's involvement cause the housing crisis. I don't think the evidence is that strong that the government role in this case toppled us into a big housing crisis. I mean, certainly affordable housing policies over the last 20 years changed the way the market looked. That market then, Wall Street then began interfacing with that market differently, and those ingredients all sort of pooled into a toxic mix that then went downhill. But other countries that didn't have the same Fannie and Freddie policies that we had also had housing crises. And so I don't think that alone suggests to me that there's not a great evidence here for this grand theory that the government caused the housing crash. That said, there is a good reason to be skeptical of why the government should be the ones originating all loans in perpetuity. And I think that that's part of the balance that the parties are trying to strike here. How do you withdraw the government from a pretty foundational part of the private sector without causing the big distortions that could hurt the housing recovery now, or deny access to people who should be getting loans by most accounts or by most estimations, but wouldn't be because of the way the transition might take place, and then without sort of freaking Americans out by totally changing the way their mortgage products looked. So It's a really delicate balance.
What I found really interesting was in one of his speeches last week, President Obama said, renting isn't bad. We shouldn't look at renting as being stigmatized, which kind of goes in the face of the previous administration. George W. Bush pushed, what he called the ownership society, where he had a lot of government policy kind of geared towards people having a stake in, like a financial stake in their way of life. And a lot of that actually went along with kind of the government, not guaranteeing, but trying to provide access to home ownership for a lot of people who it wasn't accessible towards before. And the kind of saying, the destigmatization of renting kind of flies in the face of a lot of government policy of the last, 30 years, where it was, starting with, I think in the Reagan administration, the government tried to push home ownership as kind of a value that Americans should be working towards. And I think that in the conservative narrative of the crisis, which I probably buy into a little more than you do, but the George W. Bush administration did play a fairly large part in that, with the whole narrative of the ownership society. So it's kind of interesting to me to see President Obama, who a lot of conservatives regard as an awful president and not ideologically compatible with them at all, pushing something that maybe they should be wanting, this destigmatization of renting and kind of de-emphasizing home ownership as government policy.
Yes, isn't it funny how on both sides, that when the other side does something that your side did, they suddenly get very upset about it.
Right.
I mean, I think something interesting though to think about when we think about that definitely bipartisan push across administrations in time to move more Americans into home ownership. And I think it's a really noble goal, because what you're really trying to do is to help people, like poorer people and middle class people, build wealth, build assets, and build a stake in their community. There's social benefits to it. There's clearly economic benefits to it. That in a normal way of thinking about a house, that if you own it and you are going to pay it off over time, then you'll have an asset that you can pass on to your children. That's a good thing. The problem came when we started, in part, I would argue, because middle class incomes have stagnated over such a long time, that people started reaching, and they started reaching to borrow more to build bigger houses, or they reached just to get a loan. They would get an ARM or a really sort of shady deal with the big balloon payments or whatever. Later, they borrowed more than they could take, and that's obviously not what you want. You don't want people getting in over their heads and not being able to get out from under it. But the policies, I think, contributed to pushing people that way. And let's be clear, the banks also absolutely took advantage of a lot of people. And people, let's also be clear, absolutely made some really irresponsible decisions. So you add all those things on top of each other, and what starts as a really noble goal, hey, we want people to build wealth and to gain more stake in their community, gets corrupted a bit. I mean, a lot. It almost brought down the economy because of the way that interacted with the financialization of housing. And so, I think that now all sides, conservatives, liberals, whoever, are having to step back and reassess and say, okay, we still have some of these goals. We would still like poor people to have good housing. We would still like there to be a way for people to build wealth, but we don't want it to have the same results as last time. So how do we rejigger the system to try to guard against that? While at the same time you have an entire industry that is built up both on Wall Street and on Main Street and in local chambers of commerce and whatnot that is around, entirely fueled by a robust housing economy. I mean, I would argue the housing market is propping up the economy right now, and
right.
We all have an interest in that. So it is a really complicated thing to try to do, which is why most people, I think, assumed that this sort of reform would just get punted to the next administration. But it may be the sort of thing that actually has some sort of crossover, like you mentioned, just because the ideas have been around for a long time, and everyone has kind of held them at one time or another.
Yeah, and What's interesting to me is about the kind of having a stake in your property aspect of it is that conservatives almost see it as a morality play, less than a kind of economic security, just about securing your future and having an asset. But they see it as, let's say you have a low-income community where you want people to have access to home ownership. If someone owns a home, then they have more of a stake in the improvement of their immediate community, they care if, the local schools are doing better. They care if trash pickup is on time. They care if crime goes up or crime goes down. Whereas if kind of the conservative mentality is if you're renting, those people won't really care about their communities in those ways because they can leave in a year. They don't really have that kind of improvement stake.
I would argue just on top of that, I agree with that, and I would argue that on top of that, there's also, another very important goal for conservatives is that people be able to, make a business for themselves, become a job creator. And if you have a home and you can borrow against the equity in it to start a business, that's one of the easiest ways to get seed money for a new business. And I think that's also a goal, particularly an economic goal that dovetails with the social goals you're talking about.
Right. Yeah, and obviously, if you're underwater, you can't borrow against the equity in your house.
Right.
The other kind of morality play part of it that I've seen conservatives is I wrote about a proposal that was scored by the Congressional Budget Office, I think 2 months ago, that would have allowed certain homeowners under the HAMP program to refinance. And the CBO scored this proposal as decreasing the budget deficit, decreasing federal spending, and which conservatives would be amenable to. And I got a lot of pushback saying that, this kind of amounts to a bailout for people who acted irresponsibly in trying to buy their homes. I've seen at least this kind of morality play of, well, there are these things that we could do for the housing market that will grow the economy, that will shrink the budget deficit. But, these people who made irresponsible decisions in the crisis, and that's aside from, obviously, there was predatory lending as well. But the people who didn't kind of foresee this coming deserve to have to suffer the consequences for it, which I think a lot of conservative elites and Republican leaders have to struggle with that part of their base being kind of against some of these housing proposals that would actually do both the economy and the federal government a lot of good.
Right. Well, and I wrote a lot about this during the campaign, but it's a good story and worth repeating that right after in the midst of the crisis, a couple of economists at Columbia came out with a really bold plan for the government to, initiate the writing down of billions and billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars of mortgages to try to have exactly that sort of positive effect on the housing market and the overall economy that you just talked about. One of those economists was Glenn Hubbard, who became Mitt Romney's, basically is one of his three or four chief economic advisors. Glenn Hubbard's a very smart economist. That was a very thorough paper, and it was very well argued, and it was nowhere in the Romney economic plan. And I think it was, and I tried to talk to Glenn Hubbard about it for a story. He didn't want to be interviewed for it. But suffice to say, I don't think that they thought that could fly with their base. And I don't think it's politically popular if you put it from the perspective of, let's help out the people who got in over their heads or borrowed too much. But if you explain to people, look, that house on your street that could be lost to foreclosure if we don't write down the mortgage or get a refinanced mortgage for the person who's in it, that's going to hurt you. That hurts the value of your house. So it's a little bit of like cutting off your nose to spite your face. But it's also, like you said, a very visceral moral reaction in the same way that a lot of people did not want to, and this is not limited to conservatives, a lot of liberals too. It's just a populist idea that a lot of people did not want to help the banks when they were teetering on the brink, and lawmakers had to make, it was a very unpopular, and it's only gotten more unpopular since, vote on TARP to bail them out. And I mean, it's a difficult thing, and there wasn't a vote like that for homeowners. And so because there wasn't like the Treasury Secretary pushing it through at the moment of the crisis, it went unaddressed for years. And so we've had a much slower housing recovery than we might otherwise have had with more aggressive policy. And you know, the Obama guys really did not want to do anything more aggressive. They just did not. They did not see that as a priority. And so I thought they were vulnerable to a Romney attack on them during the campaign, but clearly the campaign made the calculation that it just wasn't going to sell very well with voters.
Right. I think that was, I don't remember who, but it was pitched as the secret Romney plan to save the recovery, which was that he had Glenn Hubbard on his team, who has a very respectable and very bold housing plan that he signed on to, and that just, like you said, didn't get any traction during the campaign at all. Right. I think that President Obama might have been reluctant to take on issues like this because of the basic moral issue of the size of government. Any kind of scaling back of government support for housing could be framed as scaling back government support for low-income Americans to have access to home ownership. And you saw, I think you saw some of that reaction to this. President Obama wants to wind down Fannie and Freddie. It was just kind of an instinctual, I'm not sure that that's a good idea from some of, at least progressives that I read on the internet. So I think that if you put Glenn Hubbard and President Obama's economic team in a room, they could hammer out an amazing housing plan in 15 minutes. It's kind of gaining traction with the rest of America that might be the problem. And I'm not entirely sure that this round of housing talks is going to go anywhere. Like you said, there's a very viable plan in the Senate, the Warner-Corker plan, and Bob Corker is kind of a middle-of-the-road Republican. He's certainly not a John McCain or Lindsey Graham Rhino-type guy. So it's at least my hope that there would be some movement on this, but I'm pretty skeptical anything's going to go anywhere in Congress nowadays. But
right. And the House is always the question, right? The House is always the question.
Right.
Can they push out a bill that they can reconcile with whatever the guys in the Senate can come up with?
Right. And I don't remember who had an op-ed on this, but they said that the conservative critique of the Warner-Corker plan and President Obama's vague outline was that there's after it's all said and done, there's still too much of a government backing for the housing market, and it needs to basically go to zero, which isn't conservative in the Burkean kind of very small steps toward a better world way, but it is conservative in the get the government completely out of housing finance way, which seems pretty extreme to me, but I'm not sure how that flies in the House.
But I'm not sure. I mean, I think what you have to think about it also is what's the alternative. I mean, right now, Fannie and Freddie are writing, I think, more than 9 out of every 10 mortgages. I mean, so there will, in a rational negotiating position, where both sides start with the policy position and then they try to come toward each other until they negotiate it out until there's an agreement, you would end up with something in which almost assuredly the role of government would be dramatically diminished from what it is now over time. Yeah. But the question is, are we living in a time in which anyone in Congress is adopting rational negotiating tactics?
Right. And I think it was Bob Posen at Brookings had a couple good pieces on this last week as well, saying that kind of the broad outline from the Obama administration is solid. We'll see where it goes, though, and that basically because he's observed this in the past, that Democrats have not been amenable to some of these policy goals, but hopefully, having the leader of the party behind them would make them fall in line. But
and it would be hard to call this anything but a serious first step for negotiating. I mean, it's not like he tossed out a plan by which, Fannie and Freddie give a house to everybody in America.
Right.
This is an actual. It may be whether it's your preference or not to do it this way. This is an actual stab at filling in some blanks that have been hard to fill in and making some hard choices. And so now the logical next step would be, okay, well, we don't like the way you filled in blank C. We'll fill it in this way. We do like the way you filled in blank B. Let's go back and forth on this.
Right. Now I wanted to move on. Let's talk economy and specifically sequestration, because you've done a lot of writing about that. I've done a little bit of writing about that. Now, the kind of narrative right now, and it's kind of contradictory to me, so I wanted to get your read on this, is that sequestration is certainly hurting the economy right now in the short term. But at the same time, it's significantly slashing the budget deficit. So when Democrats go to Republicans and they say we need to get rid of sequestration, and then they say because the long-term budget deficit isn't a problem anymore, that seems a little contradictory, right? And if Republicans are to kind of buy that line of negotiation, then they would have to come back and say, well, what else would you cut that's going to cut as much over the long term as sequestration that also isn't going to do the economic damage in the short term that you're saying that this is doing right now?
Right. So I think that's true. I think that the following things are true and not contradictory, even if they sound like they are. Number one, that the macro models continue to show us that there is some damage being done to the economy by sequestration. The drag of the government sector on GDP and to a smaller but still measurable extent employment is there. It's real, and if it wasn't there, things would look better for the overall economy. And let's be clear, they don't look great right now. I mean, we're in like year 4 of them not looking great. They look okay. So that's true. It's also true that it's bringing down the deficit, and that over time that will contribute to that a lower deficit and less debt over time. Very likely, according to the research, contributes to stronger growth. So I think that's true. Both those things are true. And it's true that if you just repealed the sequester tomorrow, you would have a higher deficit in the short term. So I think that there are two important questions. The first is, how damaging would it be to have more of a deficit in the short term? And the second would be, do you replace that? I mean, do you immediately act to replace the sequester with something else that would keep the deficit down in the short term, like a tax increase or a different type of cuts, or is there something else you could do? I think that it's probably likely, and I would love to hear your thought on which of those things are how you answer those questions. But I think if you take the stance that interest rates remain very low and probably aren't going to, even though they're rising a bit, they're probably not going to spike anytime soon. We've not seen the sort of massive run-up in interest rates that was predicted even a year ago, or 2 years or 3 years ago. It's just not happened yet. So if you think that's going to persist for a little while longer, you're probably okay running higher deficits than you're running right now in the short term. And maybe the way, if you want to find an offset for the overall debt level, what you look for are guaranteed cuts longer term. So this is the sort of grand budget deal that Doug Elmendorf at the CBO has been talking about forever. More spending now, which could mean canceling sequestration. It could mean canceling sequestration and adding infrastructure. It could mean any number of ways you want to slice that up. But you couple that with credible reductions in spending programs down the line that will, whether that's change CPI and Social Security or a change in Medicare growth rates or whatever, you look to find places in the budget where you will force cuts later when presumably the economy will be doing better and you don't need expansionary deficit-driven fiscal policy.
Right. I'm certainly slightly amenable to that. I think actually there was a deal reportedly offered from President Obama to John Boehner at the end of summer 2011 during the debt ceiling negotiations that was kind of a grand bargain along those lines. And Boehner basically said, I can't take this back to my caucus and get it passed. Right. And something along those lines I would certainly say would be a huge step forward in the long term. I think that I and other conservatives are the problem with trying to, well, let's say if you take as kind of set that addressing the long-term deficit and debt is a legitimate priority for conservatives to have, which is, not everyone agrees with that. But if you just say that, that is what they are focused on, the sequestration is kind of a bad mechanism of doing that. But now that it's in place, it's hard to see a politically feasible alternative. And it kind of threatens to become like the doc fix, which was where we kept delaying cuts and delaying cuts and delaying cuts because of certain circumstances. And in this case, it would be delaying cuts because the economy is still slack. And we say, oh, we'll cut it later when times are better and it won't have as much of an effect. But the more you delay it, the harsher the cuts get on a one-time opportunity basis, right?
Right.
So if you said, we want to still cut the long-term deficit by as much as sequestration has been plotting to cut it, it's hard to see where you make that up later, right? And I would say, so I was against sequestration before it came into effect, when I think it was Q4 2012 was reported to have had negative growth.
Right.
And a lot of macroeconomic forecasting groups were saying because of sequestration, Q1 2013 was going to have negative growth, we'd be in a recession, and it was going to be super hard to pull us out of that. And it seems like, both from my perspective and probably from Republicans and conservatives' perspective, that sequestration hasn't been as bad as it was predicted to have been.
Yeah.
And you guys at the Post had a really good graphic on kind of promises that were made of how bad sequestration was going to be and what was actually happening.
Yeah.
And so the kind of discrepancy between how bad we were expecting it to be and how bad it actually is has caused conservatives to say, what's the big deal here, right?
Right. Yeah, no, and I think, we've written a lot about this, and I've written about it from even just the perspective of the Washington area economy. We haven't seen, if you're in D.C. proper, you can see some real evidence of it hurting the economy, but in the metro area, it's not that bad. Like, government contracting firms seem to have anticipated this a couple of years ago, that there was going to be a drawdown in defense spending, and they started making changes accordingly. So, yeah, it has not been, it would be hard-pressed to make an argument that it's been anywhere close to as painful this year as people initially warned it would be. Now, I talked to a lot of nonpartisan economists who say that doesn't mean it wouldn't be hard next year. And here's one thing I like to remember. I used to, long ago and far away, I covered the Colorado state legislature in a time of budget cuts. And when you cover a state legislature, you realize that lawmakers and agencies and everybody, they always try to put off pain as long as they can. So they would make these ridiculous little accounting tricks and maneuvers to make the money last a little bit longer, none of which solved their structural problems. But in hopes of more growth will come back, more money will come around the corner. In the case of when I was covering Colorado, a certain limit on state spending would be relaxed by voters so they could spend this other money. But the point is that doesn't ever show up. And the Pentagon is absolutely acting that way right now. They're not cutting weapons systems. They're just furloughing people. And that works for a little bit, but you can't do that year after year after year without just calling that a 10% wage cut or whatever. At some point you have to start cutting programs. And when programs start to get cut, it will look different. So I would, with that one caveat, agree with you that it hasn't been as painful. But I would also argue that when I read comments around town from conservative lawmakers, they do not appear to have much more appetite for further non-defense or even defense discretionary spending cuts. They seem to have moved on to safety net entitlement programs because it's hard. It's hard to cut much more from the discretionary budget than is being cut right now. And to be honest, the Ryan budget envisions steeper cuts still. But I think that the reason they are turning back to social insurance programs is a recognition of, wow, these are things that affect my constituents that are being cut.
Right. Yeah. I would agree with a lot of what you said. I talked to a couple people at DoD way back in January, and they said the attitude there was that sequestration was not going to happen, and they weren't really taking any measures to kind of prepare for it. And so what you said, where they're kind of taking these half steps and temporary measures and not really addressing it long term, is certainly something that you're seeing, and something that, if kind of a collective realization hits all these government agencies and government contractors that it is actually a permanent state of affairs, that we could see a deeper hit to the economy, and it could be the case that the economic pain has just been put off for a year, well, 6 months, a year, however long it goes. But once that realization sets in, it might be worse than what we've seen so far.
Right.
But yes, I would certainly agree that you're right in talking to Republican lawmakers on the Hill that there isn't that appetite for domestic discretionary cuts anymore. Kind of like after the Bush tax cuts, there wasn't an appetite for any more tax cuts.
Right.
And there isn't an appetite for domestic discretionary cuts now. So entitlement spending is basically all that there is left. So,
which is super unpopular to cut. I mean, right?
Right.
It's super unpopular.
Well, no. It's mildly popular in the sheer abstract.
Right.
But when you actually tell someone what would happen, it becomes very unpopular.
Right.
You know, if you go to someone and you say, we should cut entitlement spending, people hear the word entitlement spending and they say, oh yeah, that's a good idea. And then you say, well, it also means that you're going to be paying more in payroll taxes and you're going to get less when you retire. Then they say, oh no, that's awful, don't do that.
I mean, this is why, very cynically, nobody in either party is talking about changing benefits from these programs for anybody for like 10 years. Because they don't want to upset older people who are retiring now who vote, and vote in very high numbers. And from like a generational distribution, I made this argument in a piece last year, from a generational standpoint, you can argue like, hey, it's totally unfair that the boomers should be like shielded from any changes in the entitlement programs, which, I mean, they're going to be getting a lot more out of them than they paid into them.
Right.
And it would be, and you know, after having, they have went through all this great economic growth in their lives, and we are struggling through, you know, going on a decade now of difficult growth, anemic, you might say, at a time when, you know, the boomers' children are entering the workforce. So I think, you know, and that's a moral standpoint. If you're just thinking about it from like pure fiscal math, though, there is a case to be made for delaying the pain a little bit longer so that you're not pulling all that juice out of the economy. In the same reason where if for some reason you had a consensus on raising taxes to reduce the deficit, you would probably argue that you don't want to do that now. And I think it's pretty clear, we talked about the sequester, but it's pretty clear that the tax increases that we've had this year have both increased brought down the deficit and increased the drag on the economy. You know, we would be doing better if we hadn't raised those taxes, but the deficit would look worse. And these are the trade-offs we made. And Washington made the decision a couple of years ago. Sort of, you know, the president endorsed it, and the Republicans clearly were pushing for it to pivot to deficit reduction at a time when growth was still not great.
Yeah, which is, I mean, yeah, it seems odd that would be the case, but certainly Republicans don't really buy the short-term government spending is what needs to boost the economy argument.
Right.
But it still is kind of odd that in a time of, like you said, anemic growth, there aren't all that many pushes to prop up the economy or get the economy going or pump the juices or whatever.
Right. Even with tax cuts. Even with another payroll tax cut or anything like that. No one is really talking about anything like that to get more buying power back in the economy.
Right. The payroll tax cut is especially something that was odd that Republicans opposed, because you say, this is a tax cut. Isn't this what you said you wanted all along? Right.
And let's I don't want to give the Democrats any credit on that either. Everybody walked away from that like at the start of the fiscal cliff negotiations. There was no serious argument about keeping the payroll tax cut. Everybody sort of agreed that was going to go away.
Yeah. And yeah, after actually the fiscal cliff, including the payroll tax increase, the Republicans, their problem, as far as, short-term and long-term fiscal negotiations go now, is they said that they gave up all the tax cuts or the tax hikes that they would ever give up on January 1st of 2013. And, they're drawing the line there and no further, and now they want, all spending cuts. And that obviously has not a whole lot of credibility in the other party right now.
Well, it's difficult when you control one of the three parts of the how a bill becomes law process.
Yes.
That's a thing you could say if Mitt Romney were president, even probably with the Democratic Senate. But now,
right there
with a Republican House, but Democrats control the Senate and a Democrat in the White House. I mean, that's clearly just a starting position. They're not going to be able to hold that, and I think that but they don't have to be responsive to that reality yet. Right now, they are still trying to really speak to their base and say, we can do this, we can pull this off, without sort of looking at the math of, how are you going to bend them to your will, other than you are more willing to take the economy hostage than they are. Which I don't think. I think that's a strategy Republicans rejected after the last debt limit, the brinksmanship.
Right. I don't think Republicans will do the same this time, but maybe I'm naive. I don't think it'll go as far as it did in 2011, and it didn't go far. I don't remember when the last time
No, it didn't. In the early spring, they just punted it.
They punted, yeah.
Yeah,
they did the
late winter. Punted it.
They did the 3 months of spending doesn't count.
Right.
Legislation.
Which could just be what we end up with again. We could end up with 2 more years of spending doesn't count or whatever. There's all sorts of. People in Washington get very creative when they decide that they have to do something.
Right. Yes. All right. Well, I think that's all we have to explore today. Thanks a lot for coming on and talking about some of these things with me, Jim.
It was fun, Kevin. Thanks for having me.
All right, and I'll see everyone else next time on Blogging Hits.